It's a great pleasure to be here. It's absolutely wonderful to see so many of you here, colleagues, collaborators, and perhaps most important of all, so many ex-students. Just lovely to see you all here. So a very warm welcome to my inaugural lecture, and also as a committed European, I would like to take the opportunity, and we all, to say a few words in my native language, because my lovely colleague Barnaby there is recording the lecture for the benefit of those who can't be here today. So, guten Abend, meine liebe Familie, meine Freunde. Es freut mich sehr, euch heute Abend zu begrüßen zu können. Ich werde mich sehr bemühen, auf Englisch langsam zu sprechen. Bonsoir, mes collaborateurs français, particulièrement à Marina et Mark. Dobra večer. My Croatian is not good enough to say anything else. Good kväll for my Swedish relatives. And let's commence. So planning an inaugural lecture actually is not an easy thing, because it's probably the broadest audience that I will ever have in my entire life. So what I'm hoping to do today is to have a little bit of a nugget for each of you. So some of my academic colleagues will be very familiar with some of the academic research, but you might perhaps not be as cognizant about some of the practical issues. My teenage contingent here in the corner, I think I will have done my job well today if Analia hasn't picked up a book by the end of it. That's what she tends to do. And also if perhaps one of you I have inspired to perhaps think about psychology as a career. So what I've chosen to do today is really give you quite a broad overview of some of the projects that I have been involved in over the years, rather than really concentrate on any one area, and then at the end draw out the impact potentially on practice, but also share with you some honest reflections for how my research really has shaped me. So let's hope this works. Oh no, it doesn't. Okay. Right. This is Nimri when she came up with this now famous quote. And didn't she look kind of like a cross between a Fimble and Bridget Jones at the time? But actually, do you know what? It was such a proud moment for me. I had just got my doctorate. I came home full of beans, like, oh, mummy is now a doctor. And there is nothing better than the cynicism of a 3-year-old to put you back into your place. So helping businesses to make their people happy. In essence, really, that's what all of my work has been about over the last few years. When I did my own MSc, and I think it's testimony to the people who taught me that I still remember some of the lectures, almost word by word. This was an exercise that one of our professors, David Bunce, gave us to reflect on. And it was very simple. He said, look, as a budding psychologist, do you think that sometimes you might need to make a choice? Might that choice be between choice A, putting people first, where you think about people's happiness, about their motivation, their engagement in the job, in the well-being. Choice B, about organizations and putting them first. Is this about organizational productivity, efficiency, and dare I say also the dirty word, about profit? Now, of course, in an ideal world, this is what we all came up with, well, we would like to have both, wouldn't we? But isn't it so that putting people first is always a necessary precursor? Because you could probably think about a context where you've got an organization where people aren't all that happy. And I see some nods around the room, but probably at some stage in our lives all have worked in an organization like that. It will probably work for a while, but it might not work for very long, because in order to have sustainable organizations, you need to have people who are in a position where they can work in a way where they're working at their best. So choice A, I would argue, is always a precursor and a necessary condition for making organizations effective. So much of my research, unless other researchers who are really driven by theoretical problems, has always been driven by practical issues and practical problems. And the first large bit of practitioner research that I was ever involved in was exactly just that. We were on holiday on the Isle of Skye, and out of the blue I got a call from the Police Federation of England and Wales. And it was clearly a copper on the other end of the phone who was asking me, would I mind giving them a hand with a piece of research that they were doing on work-related stress? Because they had had feedback from their membership that actually stress wasn't the real issue. It was trying to combine what they did as police officers and staff with their life outside work. It was that they found so very difficult. But they didn't know how to ask questions about work-life balance. And there was one of the first pieces of research that I ever did really as a practitioner in the then Psychometric Center with my mentor, Professor John Rust. So we did the survey, we crunched the data, and interestingly, the biggest predictor of whether or not people thought they had a good work-life balance or a bad work-life balance was how much control they thought they had over their working hours. It wasn't the shifts that they worked, it wasn't the job roles that they did, it was actually having that feeling of control. And that actually tallies with a lot of the psychological research, because sometimes you can't change your job. One thing that you can always change, though, is the way that you think about it. That's something that you can always change. So when you're researching work-life balance, it's really, really important to understand the context of the organizations, understand how they're working, but also understand the kind of problems that they're being faced with. So for the police, there was the government spending review in 2010, which triggered very many organizational and operational changes because they all had to start learning how to do more with less. There's also great regional variation because all the different police forces are legal entities in their own right, and you might perhaps be able to guess that being a copper on the streets in inner city London is rather different than rescuing cats, let's say, in rural Northumbria. So the duties as such will also vary greatly. There have been pay freezes, changes pending to the pensions now, where the forces will have to put more money in the pot, which might mean that they might not be able to afford as many officers. The police has also had a rather bad press over the last few years, and that is something that has been very difficult for many officers, because by far and large you do not go into policing because you want to make lots of money. No, you go into policing because you want to make a difference and because you want to be a copper. There's also no doubt that it is a high-risk job, because particularly when you're doing frontline duties, you never know what the next day might bring. You might have weeks on end that are really rather routine, and then you might have a day all of a sudden when you're being called to two rather gruesome traffic accidents with very many casualties. But quite how your working weeks are going to pan out, that's not something that you can necessarily plan for. So perhaps not unsurprisingly, there are high rates of sickness absence. There's also this principle of policing by consent. What that means is, in a sense, the public has to trust you so that you can police them. That means that you have to build up that trust in other people. And of course, perhaps not everybody always wants to meet a police officer, but you still have to make that effort. And that's something which in psychology we call emotional labor. It's actually that emotional cost that is associated with making that connection with other people. Then very often you find high levels of work-family conflict because it's inherent to the nature of policing that somebody has to work shifts, somebody has to work Christmas, somebody has to work at New Year. So chances are your family is not going to work to that schedule, and that very often causes work-life conflict. And then the greater the work-life conflict, the greater the risk of burnout. So what can you do, and how is this being experienced? So let me just introduce you to a female police officer who is going to tell you some of her experiences in her own words.
My partner is also a full-time officer in the same force. Do you know, we haven't managed to get a similar rest day pattern at all in the last 3 years. I'm on call or they're on call. I have to work out of the geographical district quite often, so that automatically cuts down the time I can spend at home. Anyway, the last day off we had together was 2 weeks ago. We used the time constructively though. We decided it really wasn't working out. We really couldn't make it work. Well, how can we when we're ships that pass in the night? So, yeah. The last day off we had together, we used to divide up the CD collection and decide who was going to take on custody of the cat. Sad, really. It was the first day we'd spent together for weeks.
So quite a vivid illustration, I think, what happens when two of you are working opposite shifts, you never see each other. And that is very common in policing. Many police officers indeed are married to other police officers, often because they're the ones who understand what the job is really like. I was talking to Dr. John Bailey, who was one of my doctoral students, who said, actually, it's exactly the same with doctors, that often they try to have relationships with people who aren't doctors or healthcare professionals, but actually very often the relationships don't work because the other person doesn't necessarily understand. So what can you do about these issues then, of course, is the question. And that's something that led us to another piece of research, again very much practice-based, where we took a behavioral approach, because some of the constants in policing you can't change, because people will have to work shifts, they will have to work nights, they will have to work at Christmas and at New Year. But what you can always change is how you think about things and also how you behave. And there is good evidence to suggest that when you're looking at work-life balance, one of the things that you need to understand is how people are actually managing their own work-life balance. What do they actually do that is helpful to them? And I remember when I first had this idea, we need to be looking at behaviors. One of my academic colleagues said, "Oh, how naive of you, Almuth. What a silly idea. Surely it's the organizations we need to change." But I said, well, organizations consist of people, so surely you also need to be starting with the people. And actually, again, there is good evidence to suggest that if you get people to think about managing their work-life balance at an individual level, that actually that in itself then can start to trigger organizational change. So this is what we did. It was a very large police force in the southeast of England, which liked to think of itself as modernizing. Robin can probably work out which of the ones it was. So they're very keen to do something proactive about work-life balance. And what we did, first of all, we interviewed serving officers and staff, but rather than focusing on problems, we asked them actually, when work-life balance works for you very well, what do you do that helps you? What are the conditions that make it possible? As psychologists would then do, we then did a card sort task where we wrote all of these behaviors down on cards, and we did a clustering task to see how they might hang together with each other. We then constructed a very simple survey questionnaire, which we then validated with a bigger sample, so we asked more people. And I've sort of simplified the findings here, but in essence, these are the things that they needed to take care of in order to enable their own work-life balance. The self keeping perspective and keeping priorities. And part of that was actually to actively recognize that work-life balance is a really important thing. So if we want to manage it ourselves, actually, we kind of have to put the issue on the table almost on a daily basis. We need to negotiate with others because others are not going to know what is helpful to you. So you need to tell them. And if they don't like it, what you tell them, you need to negotiate again. So it's about that constant negotiation process. You can't do it on your own, so you need to actively use support from others around you. And last but certainly not least, well, you also need to be smart about managing your work, so being good about setting priorities, about setting timelines, and so on and so forth. So these are my top tips for managing your own work-life balance. This then, in a roundabout way, led to me being involved in a very large collaborative research project spearheaded by MOPAC, by the Mayor's Office for Policing in London, together with my wonderful colleagues from UCL, from ICPR here at Birkbeck, and also with a team here from organizational psychology. And I guess you might have seen many stories in the press about this policing training, as we know it, is changing fundamentally. Because so far, when you train to become a copper, you were trained to what we would call pre-university level. But make no mistake, crime is changing. Crime is becoming much, much, much more complex. Growth in cybercrime, human trafficking, where you almost have global supply chains. And the nature of some of those crimes is now so complex that you need very, very different skill sets to be able to solve those crimes than maybe you did in the past. So there was another project that I had the good fortune to be involved on. By the way, the report is still on the MOPAC website, very accessible. Do read it. It gives you all the details about the project. So different questions that we looked at. So what is the evidence on graduate conversion? These are the kind of questions that Yotti looked at, because graduate conversion is not a new thing, has been done for many years in other professions, but actually how does it work? Do people actually then become good graduates in their new profession? How do you actually facilitate good graduate conversion training? What do graduates bring to any training process? So that was one of the questions that I also looked at. Can you train evidence-based policing? Evidence-based policing, in a sense, is the overall basis of the new police qualifications and education framework. So really to encourage people, rather than thinking, yep, if I do that, it's kind of going to work, to really think, no, actually, is there a best way of going about it? And what kind of evidence should I actually use to underpin my decisions? So this is an example of one of the pieces of research that we did. We basically gave people puzzles to solve, the kind of puzzle that they would encounter in neighborhood policing. So very diverse community, an immigrant family, the boys have been a bit naughty, the neighbors aren't terribly happy and are going, oi, can you do something about that? You've now been helicoptered in to diffuse the community tension. Faced with that situation, what would you actually do? So we gave them some closed questions where they kind of had to say yes or no or choose an answer, but they also had to write out an outline of what it was that they would actually do, and we then coded that data. So one of the things that we were interested in, actually, can you train people in evidence-based policing as part of policing training or through self-education, or sort of weaving much more of an evidence strand throughout policing training? And I won't go into the full findings now, but what our research showed was, yes, you can train that evidence-based mindset. The effects are definitely there, and people become better at using evidence. Once they've had the training, they are much better at taking a more holistic perspective. They're also much more likely to be wanting to do any kind of evaluation. As part of that research project, we also asked experts, so people who are actually training police officers, dry, stuffy academics such as myself, to also do that kind of puzzle solving that I just showed you. What they told us was actually they find that really, really, really hard. What that data is showing to me, actually, when we're thinking about how we reconfigure policing training, you can't just have academics training budding police officers. You also have to have practitioners training budding police officers, because only they will know what it is like to actually be doing the job in practice. So yes, we need the evidence, but we also need to have the know-how about the actual operations on the ground. So that was research example number 2. Now, on to a controversial topic. That was a research project that I worked on a couple of years back with my partner in crime and research over there, Zara. Great fun. Took me a little bit out of my comfort zone, if I might admit that, because it was about executive rewards. And it wasn't really a topic that I had in particular researched beforehand, but it was one of the ones that had always really, really bugged me. So when we applied to the CIPD, they had an open call. They were looking for the best research team. When we got it, I was jolly pleased, because it was just such a meaty and controversial topic to be getting our heads round. Why do I have a very overweight cat there on the left-hand side? Because every year, sometime in January, you will have Fat Cat January or Tuesday. I think last year it was a Tuesday, which is a day kind of usually in the 3rd week in January, when the average employee in the UK where the average CEO in the UK at that point will have earned as much as the average employee in the entire year. Just to give you an idea of the scale of actually what the difference in earnings actually is. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? What, in a sense, are the precursors of these huge gaps in rewards? And if anything, should we be doing something about it? So I've got a little film clip for you, which my friend Adam did, and I hope this is going to work, which tells you all about the research and the key findings. Cheesy music, by the way. Okay, so that was the story of our reward project. But really the take-home message from this, in a nutshell, for me was organizations don't always think or behave rationally because there is no evidence to why CEO rewards should be growing at really quite such an exponential pace, when surely we ought to be thinking about much more sustainable working practices. We need to pay much, much more attention to how we select and coach people right at the top of organizations, and surely there should be a much, much stronger mandate for organizational leadership to more fully reflect the breadth of our UK society. So that was the rewards research project. The always on culture, a research topic which I've been working on and off with my collaborator and great friend Gail, coming out of the work that we've been doing as part of the Work-Life Balance Working Group, which has been funded through the British Psychological Society. And next year we'll have our 10th anniversary. I know, when we set it up, we always said that we would disband it if we didn't have to talk about work-life balance anymore. I don't think we've reached that stage yet, so we will keep going. So, the always-on culture, why is that such an important topic? Because life's most giant experiment is taking place all around us. Work as we know it is fundamentally changing. We are now working remotely, we're working digitally, we're working in very fluid, matrix-based, project-based organizations. So how we structure work and how we communicate with each other has fundamentally changed. And surely we need to be understanding what kind of impact this has had on people. So first of all, I've got some quick questions to all of you. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands and say a yes or no. Do you check your phone on the toilet? Are you more likely to be on your gadgets at night than read a book? Do you tell your kids off for being on the phone all the time? And do they then do the same thing to you? Stop laughing, girls. Do you have gadget-free zones at home or at work where you actually make a conscious decision not to be connected to your electronic devices? Do you set examples to your staff, to your co-workers, to your fellow pupils, fellow students about when and how to use technology for communications? Well, these are questions that all of us really ought to be thinking about, because the reality is we're all working now using various gadgets, but we ought to be thinking about what that is actually doing to our work and to our work-life balance. So whilst the previous work-life balance project was very much focused on asking people who work in an organization, this time round, we asked the organizations what they are doing about the always-on culture. So we did a very simple practice-based survey which went out to really quite a broad range of different industries, different respondents, and basically we wanted to know, look, what are you actually doing about the always-on culture? You know, what kind of systems and processes do you have in place? And what our data showed us, not very much. Over half of organizations told us, well, we don't have a work-life balance policy in place. If anybody is responsible in your organization for informations and technology communications use, most of them actually saw it as an IT issue rather than as a line management issue. And I find this a worrying thing because, yes, these gadgets need to be used appropriately, but actually a lot of the stuff really is around communications and about management rather than about ICT use. Does your organization offer any guidance to staff on how to use these gadgets? And nearly 60% said no, absolutely sweet nothing. So what the data here was showing is actually organizations really, on average, aren't really doing enough about the issue. So what are the effects? Well, there is no mistake that these little helpers can be helpers indeed, because they can help communication, they make communication more immediate, they can help productivity, or at least they might make you think that they help productivity. They can help teamwork, and also they help your customers because they can very easily get in touch with you. But they're also negative because a fifth of people were saying actually they have an impact on our well-being, this actually always having to be always on. They have an impact on relationships at work because we all email each other. We no longer walk over to each other's desks or even be as old-fashioned as actually pick up a phone and actually ring somebody. So they have a negative effect on communication. So what is it that organizations ought to be doing about these issues? Well, I do worry about the kind of blanket policies that are very popular in my home country in Germany, where you have initiatives such as emails will be held on a server overnight. So between 5:30 at night and 9:30 in the morning, you simply cannot access your emails. I don't think that's a wise idea for two reasons, because A, it doesn't stop you from working. You might just be doing other things. And also there is a whole host of psychological research that tells us that those kinds of interventions work much, much better if people have had a say in them. So if they tell you this is what they would like, this might be a good thing, but you need to ask people first and you need to get them involved. And surely also you need to be training, you need to be building line management and leadership capacity, because work is changing at a very, very rapid pace. And I do worry that in a sense the leadership capability isn't really keeping up with some of these changes. So that was the always on culture. So continuing on with the work-life balance theme. This is the last research project that I'm going to be telling you about, fresh hot off the press. Really, really rewarding for me to work in, because those of you who know me a little bit better know that I trained as a classical dancer initially, which is why I still walk like a duck on occasion and get teased mercilessly by my family. And I then didn't have anything to do with dance for, God, the best part of 20 years. I didn't even want to go to the theatre and watch dance because it was just a little bit too close to home. But over the last few years, I found my appetite for ballet again, and indeed that's what a good part of my annual salary now goes on, is going to the Royal Opera House to see the Royal Ballet. So Kathy and Anna, who can't be here today, they are leading, in a sense, a lobbying organisation which is called Parents in the Performing Arts, because it is a very, very stark reality that if you're a performing artist, and particularly if you're a woman, you tend to disappear once you've had children. You're no longer as castable, you don't get offered as many roles. And why should that be the case? Because you don't stop being a good artist just because you have had a baby. So Kathy and Anna did some research just in the theatre world a few years ago, and they wanted to follow up that research across theatre, music and dance to look at how are carers in the performing arts actually experiencing work. Do carers work differently? Can we actually detect any kind of impact on carers once they've had children? So we helped them construct a very extensive survey, and we got more than 2,500 participants, so really juicy data, which academics get very excited about. We are still crunching it now. The full report will be published in January. But just to give you some really headline statistics, So one of the things that we looked at was people's so-called employment status. How do they work? Do they work full-time, part-time, or do they work freelance? And what this very, very simple graph here tells you is nearly 60% of people who work in the performing arts are freelancers. That is nearly 4 times as many as you would find in the average UK working population. Also, most of them actually work without any kind of contract. So what that means is work overall in the performing arts is very, very precarious indeed, because if you lose your current work because you don't have a contract, you can be not very sure that you might find work again. We also found that the employment structure varied greatly between carers, and I call them non-carers, not they're not caring, but simply the ones who haven't got caring responsibility. This simple graph here. And again, what that tells you is that those who are carers are even more likely to work freelance and even less likely to be in full-time employment. So what are some of the stories that are behind these very crude figures? Well, 1 in 3 carers had to change their job role and or their job locations once they had become parents, because it simply is very, very difficult once you've had a child, let's say, to go on a UK national tour with a panto. It's very, very difficult to perform in a West End musical where you're on 7 nights a week, and very often these days also 2 matinees. It's very difficult unless you've got somebody in the family who is willing to help you to find childcare out of hours. We also looked at self-reported earnings, and what our data showed us there very clearly, that in the sense there is a caring penalty. On average, carers in the performing arts earn £3,000 less per annum. Now, to some of you, £3,000 a year might not seem like very much, but baseline earnings are on average very low. They only earn about, on average, £20,000 per year. So those £3,000 are going to make the difference between being able to afford an annual holiday, between being able to put your children into school uniform or not, or indeed affording childcare. So starts a vicious circle, because if you can't afford childcare, you then also can't go to auditions, and you will be missing out on the next job opportunity, which is why nearly 8 out of 10 carers regularly have to turn down work opportunities. When we looked at the psychological well-being, we found very, very high levels of engagement, because you go into the performing arts because you really, really love your job. But we found very low levels of work-life balance, very high levels of job insecurity, and very low levels of employability. Taken together, that is quite a toxic combination, which would suggest that people actually put themselves at very, very high risk of burnout. So this is a piece of research that I so hope we can get some follow-up funding for, to really drill down into some of these issues, because actually, curiously, even though the performing arts make a huge contribution to the UK economy, and long may it continue, Brexit allowing, there are actually not very much research. It's a really, really wide spot on the research agenda. So it was a real privilege for me to, in a sense, come back to my roots and work in the arts again. So other important topics that I've got on my radar, and that is mainly sparked by this wonderful lady here, now Dr. Doyle, who successfully defended her viva a month ago. This is a picture of the two of us on the actual, and if anything, I think I look even more naked than Nancy did. Because it's that kind of, anxious parent moment when you're outside the Viva room and, oh my God, and I knew she would absolutely nail it, but still you can't help worrying. So I used to do research on coaching, don't do that so much anymore, hence the connection with Nancy, because what she wanted to find out is, does coaching make a difference as a reasonable adjustment for people who've got dyslexia? And ta-da, her data shows absolutely yes it does, because rough estimations are that 1 in 10 people, if you think about the people around you, that is a huge percentage of people who are in the room here today, has got some kind of special requirements. They might be dyslexic, they might have ADHD. The law is very, very clear that organizations and the workplace has to adapt to the individual and not the other way around, but also the reality is that most workplaces don't really know what to do about this. So that is one of the emerging topics that I feel very, very passionate about indeed. So, what impact has the research had? Well, it has helped putting topics on the table, I would hope, such as the survey on work-life balance that we did early on. It was one of the first in the police, which is still quite a command and control, quite macho culture, but actually allowed a conversation about issues that perhaps otherwise they might not have talked about. An impact on practice and evaluation, not always in a direct way. The second example, when we looked at work-life balance facilitation skills, by the time we had done the research, the 4 said, oh God, we're on to other topics now. We're no longer all that interested, can happen. But then actually, curiously enough, the fire service in France is now using the indicator too. The indicator tool is now being used in Australia, so it had reached just not quite where I wanted it to go. And also getting practitioners interested in writing up research. So some of the data from the policing training project, we're actually now writing up with practitioners from the organizations who took part in the research. And actually that has been one of the most rewarding things to do, because I don't think at the beginning of that project they would have been quite as minded to do that. And to me, that's impact. So this brings me to the soppy bit of the presentation, because I have to say a huge, big thank you to so many people who've helped me in my journey. I can't possibly mention all of them. I also couldn't squeeze all of them onto my photo collage, also because I've got the photo collage skills of a 5-year-old. But there have been many, many inspirational women from near and far, students, PhD students, colleagues. I do have to single out Gail, because honestly, you've been an amazing buddy, and I can genuinely say without you, I wouldn't be here where I am today. So thank you, Gail. And likewise, everybody needs a Mark Saunders in their life. Mark is this dude over here who was the reviewer for one of my very, very early papers, unblinded himself with a comment saying, there's some good findings in there, but the person really, really can't write. So Mark has been a mentor and a source of inspiration for me ever since. I also need to mention my boss, Philip, who's been a true champion of equality, which I really thank you for. A question to the teenage contingent: how many rock stars can you spot in the picture? Spot the non-psychologist. I will test you afterwards. I will want a full list of names. Got them all? Excellent. Well done. Many, many thanks to my weird and wonderful and totally amazing family. I had only one picture where I had all of them, and Nimwi said, you're dead to me if you put that picture up. Because it was from about 3 years ago when she used to wear her hair in a donut. She no longer does that, so I wasn't allowed the picture. So many, many thanks to my wonderful family. And I also said I would share with you what impact the research has had on me. I learned that communication is absolutely key, that timing is everything, because sometimes by the time you've done field research, practice has moved on, and sometimes there is nothing that you can do about it. But one of the things that I've learned from that, and actually that will be a special paper written by Lizzie and Robin and everybody in our upcoming special issue, actually is about the role of project management in research, which sometimes we tend to forget. It's also perhaps not a skill that comes very easily to us academics, and that also we can learn a lot from the performing arts. And really being engaged in that piece of research with Pippa really brought home with me a number of things that we can learn from the arts, because if you're working on a production and your Panto opens in 5 weeks' time, you can't just say what you would do in academia: oh, let's have another working group, oh, shall we have another committee, ooh, let's debate that issue again. You kind of just absolutely have to make it work, and there is something to be said from that. The other thing that we have in the arts is a real respect for our art, and a respect for the people that teach us, and a respect for the people that influence us. So at the end of each class, at the end of each performance, you do a reverence, which is a thank you to everybody who's influenced you. Go away now, that was really not fair. But it's also a reverence to the art form. So here is my reverence to all of you. Thank you very much.